True story that I went to find out. Abandoned hospital in St. Augustine. When Milton Construction Company, a well-known name in the construction industry, decided to take on the renovation of St. Augustine Hospital, a creepy abandoned building in Massachusetts, they thought it would be a normal renovation project. However, none of them expected that behind those moss-covered walls was a horrifying story. St. Augustine Hospital was closed in 1953 after a series of scandals involving unexplained deaths of inpatients. Rumors have it that inhumane experiments were carried out there that led to the painful deaths of many innocent people. Jack, the head of Milton's construction crew, is a tough guy who doesn't believe in psychics. To him, this project is just another job to do. David, a talented but shy architect, and Emma, a curious and courageous girl, are in charge of the project. The first days of the renovation of St. Augustine Hospital passed peacefully. However, within the first week, the team began to feel that something was wrong with the atmosphere around the building. A cold, invisible feeling clung to their every step. The lights kept flickering, even though they had just been replaced. The hospital space seemed to echo endlessly, each step echoing eerily, as if someone was secretly watching their every move from a dark corner. Late one evening, as Jack was checking the machinery in the basement, he heard soft footsteps, fleeting like a breath in the cold wind. At first, Jack reassured himself that it was just an echo, but the footsteps grew louder, becoming urgent and urgent. Jack turned around, the flashlight shining into every corner, but only cold darkness responded. When the flashlight flickered for the last time, a shadowy figure passed by. A whisper echoed in his ears, a dark and cold voice. "Save me." David, who was shy by nature, began to be affected by this heavy atmosphere. For the first time, he heard a soft cry coming from the end of the corridor, a distant but plaintive sound, as if a forgotten soul was desperately calling for help. Emma was also caught up in this vortex of horror. Once strong and curious, she now began to have nightmares that would not stop. Every night, she dreamed that she was walking down the hospital corridor, with dim lights illuminating the blood-stained walls. In her dream, a child's voice called her name, both familiar and urgent. But when Emma turned around, there was only a pale figure, standing still with black eyes. As people began to sense the strange phenomena more clearly, their minds gradually became panicked. Jack, who had always been calm, now often felt angry and uneasy for no apparent reason. Sometimes he felt like he was being controlled by someone, leading him to unknown places in the hospital. The deeper he went into the hospital's basement, the more the light from David's flashlight, seemed to be sucked into the thick darkness. It felt suffocating, as if something didn't want him to go any further, but curiosity urged him to move forward. Suddenly, his hand touched an old, rusty iron door. David tried to push the heavy door open. A creepy creak, creak sound echoed throughout the dark basement, like the scream of something being imprisoned. Beyond the door was a room plunged into absolute darkness, where his flashlight illuminated only patches of dust that shimmered in the dense air. David took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but he couldn't stop his heart from pounding as the flickering light revealed a gruesome sight. Rusted medical chairs with straps, wrapped tightly as if holding something back. Broken syringes littered the floor, and abandoned medical equipment lay haphazardly, as if some terrible experiment had been abruptly halted. David approached the back wall, where a rotting stench filled the air. As the flashlight shone, a horrific sight appeared that sent a chill down his spine. A pile of human bones. Empty skulls, lifeless eyes staring at David from nowhere. Tiny pieces of bone scattered on the floor. The air in the room was heavy, so quiet it was eerie that he could hear his own ragged breathing. David stepped back, but the flashlight beam illuminated an old filing cabinet that held the hospital's darkest secrets. He opened each drawer with trembling hands, revealing old medical records that documented gruesome experiments on innocent patients, detailing the pain they endured. The records had names and pictures of patients in their final, terrifying states, their faces filled with hatred and helplessness. As the flashlight beam traced each image, each word, David felt as if he were lost in a nightmare. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead, his heart pounded, but he could not take his eyes off the scene before him. He sensed strange whispers coming from empty skulls, lost voices echoing from the underworld, filled with anger and resentment. David felt as if he were surrounded by wounded souls, still trapped here, never to be freed.
I'll never let you go. Never.
Just as David decided to turn around and run, a cold, invisible hand suddenly touched his shoulder. The icy coldness spread from his shoulder to his spine, making him stiffen. A hoarse voice rang out from behind, as if from deep underground. "Don't leave us." The voice made David freeze. He felt as if hundreds of eyes from the pile of bones were watching him, surrounding him, giving him no way out. In a panic, he screamed and ran up the stairs, the mournful screams following his every step. When he reached the ground, David collapsed, his body shaking, his breathing rapid as if he had just escaped the most terrible nightmare of his life. Emma began to have terrible nightmares from her first days working at St. Augustine Hospital. Every night, her sleep was disturbed by the image of a woman with a resentful expression. In the cold light of her dream, the woman appeared with a pale face, her eyes empty and deep as if filled with resentment. She stared at Emma, unblinking, as if trying to convey a message from the underworld. In one of her most terrifying dreams, Emma found herself standing in a long, cold hospital corridor with stained walls and a foul stench. The mysterious woman walked slowly towards Emma, each step making a cracking sound. She raised her hand, revealing bruises and cracked fingernails, and pointed toward an old iron door, her voice soft but filled with anger. "Look, what they did to me." The door opened, revealing a dark room, only illuminated by Emma's weak flashlight. Shadows appeared, shackled patients with bloodshot eyes, pale faces, and pain. Suddenly, a scream tore through the silence, and all the ghosts seemed to rush toward Emma, screaming with hateful voices, "Don't leave them alone." Emma screamed, waking up in the middle of the night, cold sweat drenching her body, her heart pounding in her chest. Waking up in a dark room, Emma was still overwhelmed by the feeling of the terrible dream she had just had. The darkness in the room seemed to thicken. Faint sounds echoed from the hidden corners. Whispering cries, the sound of children sobbing. That sound seemed to permeate the space, endless, endless. Emma turned on the light. The pale yellow light covered the room, but the cold feeling still clung to every corner, as if nothing could dispel it. The next day, Emma tried to pretend nothing had happened, but the fear from the dream had left a lasting mark. She felt like she was being watched. Every step, every glance into the dark corners of the building made her jump. As she walked down the hallway, she felt like someone was standing behind her, watching her every move. But when she turned around, there was only cold darkness. She heard soft, slow footsteps right next to her ear, faint breathing, and a mournful whisper. That night, as Emma drifted off to sleep, the nightmare recurred, but more vivid and terrifying. In her dream, the woman stood before her, her hands clutching the iron door of the dark room. A scream of anger and pain echoed from the room, demanding justice. The woman turned, her eyes bloodshot, her lips opening as if to say something, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. Instead, the bruises on her body became clear, patches of skin peeling away, revealing the dark flesh underneath. Emma wanted to scream, but her classic was restored, her lips unable to make any sound. The woman walked slowly towards her. Each step she took made the air colder. As she got closer, the cries of children echoed throughout the room, echoing like an echo from a faraway place filled with more blood.
Help me!
The next morning, Emma was no longer herself. Her eyes were dark, her face was haggard, and her mind was severely affected. She began to panic, had trouble sleeping, and even avoided people around her for fear that if she told anyone, no one would believe her. The fear from the terrifying dream and the ghost lurking in the dark began to destroy Emma's spirit, pulling her into a spiral with no way out. Jack gradually became tired and extremely stressed when every night, in the pitch-black darkness of the hospital, he could not escape the eerie whispering sounds echoing from the basement. The screams were like those of suffering, desperate souls demanding release, lasting so long that Jack almost lost sleep completely. His eyes were dark, his face pale, and every night he was haunted by the vague image of a cold hallway, echoing mysterious calls that seemed to urge him closer to the darkness. One night, when he could no longer bear it, Jack was compelled to go down to the basement, the deepest part of the hospital where the darkness seemed to weigh down on his every step. The space was filled with an eerie silence, and Jack stopped in front of an old wall, where the flickering flashlight illuminated the dried bloodstains on the surface. At that moment, he realized he was no longer alone. An angry ghost appeared from the darkness, the figure of a patient, his body covered in wounds, his wide eyes staring at him full of hatred. A scream rang out in the silence, carrying the rage of hundreds of tormented souls. Return, justice. Jack stepped back, but his feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. His breathing became heavy. Jack felt as if an invisible hand was squeezing his throat, preventing him from making any sound. The ghost approached, its face twisted in pain, demanding he pay for what had happened in this hospital. Jack tried to retreat with all his might, but every step he took only brought the ghost closer, its pale eyes boring into his mind. Finally, Jack escaped the darkness, rushing out of the basement with ragged breath, his body shaking and his mind reeling. That night, he realized that he could not escape this nightmare. The vengeful spirits were always present, lurking in the darkness, demanding justice, and would never let go until they were freed from the curse here. David, a timid architect, was sinking deeper and deeper into an inescapable fear. Over the past few days, the ghosts had become more apparent than ever. Whenever David entered the empty rooms, especially the closed room where he had discovered the remains, a suffocating, cold feeling enveloped him, as if the darkness was thickening and coming to life. The room seemed to have a life of its own, imprisoning and chaining the tormented souls, making him feel as if he was being devoured every second. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light, but a living entity, clinging to him like an invisible hand clinging to his flesh. Whenever David turned his head, shadowy figures appeared in the corners of the room, their faces distorted, their hollow eyes staring at him intently, as if conveying a pain that would never be released. David gradually lost the ability to distinguish between reality and illusion. The whispering voices crept quietly through the darkness, becoming clearer and clearer, like heartbreaking cries, like the oaths of those who had endured the ultimate torment. Emma also began to notice the strangeness of the hospital. One night, as the wind whistled through the dark hallways, Emma and David decided to work together to uncover the secrets buried at St. Augustine. Their minds were tense. Their every step echoed in the absolute silence, and every corner of the hospital seemed to groan, like an eternal pain that could not be soothed. Through the old documents they found, along with the anxious stories of the locals, a terrible truth gradually emerged. The doctor who had run St. Augustine Hospital turned out to be a heartless man who had performed brutal experiments on innocent patients. Hundreds of people had suffered unimaginable pain, and many had died in horrific conditions, with pain and resentment etched deep in their souls. Those unfortunate people can never be released. Their souls are trapped forever in this gloomy hospital, where their screams blend into every wall, every brick. As the two continued their search, the flashlight beam illuminated the dried bloodstains and strange markings on the walls, as evidence of a dark ritual once performed to trap spirits. Emma and David stopped in front of the sealed room, where the space seemed to thicken with deep hatred. David could not help but feel a chill as the flashlight beam illuminated the scratches on the wall, the scrawled words of curses. As the wind howled around the room, Emma heard a whisper close to her ear, a woman's hoarse voice. "We can't leave." Emma stepped back, her hand clutching David's, her eyes fixed on a blurry figure in the corner of the room, a woman with a pale face, eyes empty but filled with hatred. She looked at them, her hands outstretched as if pleading for help, but her eyes were filled with hatred and a thirst for revenge. The flashlight went out for a moment, and the space was plunged into absolute darkness. Crying and screaming intertwined, tearing the atmosphere apart. A cold, gloomy sound rang out, as if echoing from the depths of the underworld. "Give us justice." Back, David and Emma felt the darkness tighten around them, heavy and suffocating. They wanted to run away, but their legs seemed frozen in place, as if an invisible force was tying them to the sins of the hospital's past. After a while, the flashing lights flickered and the growing darkness disappeared, leaving the room empty and cold. Emma and David, running and scared, escaped the apartment, but in their minds, the image of the chained souls and the thirst for justice still lingered. Both knew that, until the ghosts were released, the words of the past would forever be a part of St. Augustine Hospital, and no one could escape what was buried deep in the darkness. Emma and David, after a series of terrifying experiences at St. Augustine's Hospital, decide that the only way to end the haunting is to free the trapped spirits. They turn to an old book that contains an ancient ritual to free the bound spirits. They hope that this ritual can somehow put the spirits to rest and bring peace to the building. On the night of the decision, they gathered all the necessary items and entered the sealed room, the place where the souls were tortured. The air in the room was thick and cold, as if death was still lurking around them. Emma held the flashlight, the light flickering faintly while David took out the old book, turning to the ritual page. His heart pounded, as if he wanted to run away from what was about to happen. As they began to chant the first spells, a cold wind blew from somewhere deep in the darkness. The flashlight in Emma's hand flickered, its light fading and then going out. They stood in absolute darkness, and the silence was oppressive, like a black curtain, choking their every pulse and breath. Suddenly, a savage laugh rang out, tearing the quiet space apart. The sound was not like a human laugh, but more like a scream mixed with laughter, carrying with it the utmost pain and hatred. Emma held her breath, trying to calm herself, but the feeling of fear grew in her heart. Heavy footsteps rang out, rushing, as if hundreds of footsteps were simultaneously moving towards them. In the darkness, Emma saw a figure in the flickering light of her flashlight. It was a woman, her eyes wide, haggard and lifeless. Her face was pale and distorted, her lips moving as if to convey a final message. Emma backed away in fear, but her hand clutched the book, unwilling to let go. She knew that this might be her last chance to help the trapped souls. David stood beside her, staring at her in horror. He tried to scream, begging her to say something, but only silence and darkness answered. David was so desperate that he felt like he was sinking into a nightmare from which he could not wake up. The whispers began to grow louder, surrounding him from all sides, each word tearing at his mind, making it impossible for him to escape the vortex of fear. Emma, in her utmost fear, finally mustered up the courage to recite the final prayers to free the souls. Her voice was trembling but full of determination, each word coming from the depths of her fear as if to dispel the darkness that was suffocating them. As she finished the final spell, the entire room shook violently. Screams rang out from all directions, tearing the air apart as if the last souls had been released. It felt like all the pain and resentment that had been stored up for decades had exploded in an instant. Emma and David were caught in a whirlpool of sound and darkness, their visions blurred, leaving only the blurry images of ghosts dissolving into the air.
This place is haunted.
When everything settled down, a strange silence filled the room. Emma looked around. No more ghosts, no more screams, but a strange emptiness lingered in the space. Her hands trembled, and a nameless sadness welled up in her heart, as if she had lost something precious. David stood beside her, his eyes staring blankly into nothingness. They said nothing, only feeling that everything had changed, as if the spirits had left, but left an indelible mark. When everything settled down, a strange silence filled the room. Emma looked around. No more ghosts, no more screams, but a strange emptiness lingered in the space. Her hands trembled, and a nameless sadness welled up in her heart, as if she had lost something precious. David stood beside her, his eyes staring blankly into nothingness. They said nothing, only feeling that everything had changed, as if the spirits had left but left an indelible mark. Weeks passed, the memory still haunting them like a ghost, but both of them slowly began to accept that it was over. Until one evening, when David unexpectedly received a text message from an unknown number. He looked at the screen, his heart pounding as the message appeared. "Come back. They are still waiting." David and Emma both felt a chill down their spines, their hearts clenched with fear, hovering between the border of nightmare and reality. That message, like a call from the underworld, raised an unanswered question. Are the souls still not completely freed, or is there still some mystery waiting for them to return? This ending is just the beginning of a never-ending nightmare. Will David and Emma dare to face St. Augustine again in the sequel? Let's wait and find out.